What is going on, everyone? Welcome to the Venue RX podcast. My guest today is someone who is going to help me dive into the nitty-gritty of a very important part of being a venue owner, being someone who's interested in wedding and event venues. And, even if you're someone who is in the wedding and events industry and, maybe you aspire to own a venue one day, the stuff that we're going to be talking about today, the topics we're going to be talking about are very foundational and really, really are important when thinking about wedding venue ownership, working at wedding venues and things like that. So I am so thrilled to welcome Bonnie Galam to the show today. Bonnie, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited for our conversation today.
Well, I'm really excited as well. I was just telling you right before we got on, it's some of the marketing and sales and tours and some of that other stuff feels very fun and exciting to talk about. But if you don't set up your venue right, if you don't purchase it right, if you're not doing the financing right, some of those different things, then, you can really be in a world of hurt for quite a long time, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I always say the legal is not the sexy stuff, but if you don't, create this like solid foundation that you build your business upon, then you could really just be building a house of cards. And that's not what you want. You want to be laying the foundation strong right from the outset. That way, as your business grows and expands, you can focus on the marketing stuff and not on the foundational stuff, which frankly, once you kind of take care of it is pretty hands off, maybe an hour or two or a year just to make sure everything's up to date.
So that's why this podcast needs to be, and this YouTube video needs to be one of the most watched and the most listened to, because we need folks to really do this part right, correct? So that we can build on everything else.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I love it. So you are a real estate lawyer. Can you tell me a little bit about how you got into that? And then what was the segue between that and then the wedding industry?
Sure, absolutely. And let me tell you, it's a roundabout story because I feel like there are no straight paths in life. And my story definitely is not one of them. And that was that I went to law school to be a criminal prosecutor. While I was there, I met a guy and he happened to be a real estate investor. After law school, I did the thing. I was a criminal prosecutor for several years. But during that time, we were building up our own real estate holdings and I became obsessed. I wanted to learn everything I could about real estate investing, about real estate law, and eventually kind of got to the point where I was doing the behind the scenes work and we started phasing out our lawyers. And eventually I started up my own firm to help other real estate investors manage their legal stuff as well. Eventually, go ahead.
Real quick question about that. Why criminal law? Like what initially got you interested in that?
So again, a roundabout story, of course, but what had happened was when I was an undergrad, I took a business law class. I was a business administration major and business law like 101 was a class we had to take. And I loved it. I loved it. And through that, I did a few internships at different law firms and I saw what I liked and I saw what I didn't like. And what I noticed is I loved being hands-on and like having this really one-to-one kind of connection with my clients, because I had worked in firms where you had either like very, very large corporate clients, or I worked in a class action law firm where you'd have like one client, but you'd be representing, a class of hundreds of thousands of people, when you get that like $5 check in the mail because Target or something screwed something up. Like I was doing that kind of work and I hated it. I mean, it was a very interesting and lucrative area of law, but in terms of like how I spent my day to day, I didn't like it. I really wanted to be like positively affecting people's lives with my law degree. And I thought, what a better way than that than to go into the criminal justice system. And to be honest, it's probably the most fun job I ever had. Ever as a lawyer was being a criminal prosecutor, because I got to be on my feet in courtrooms all day. Really, I felt like making a very positive impact. I was a domestic violence prosecutor. And so I was really, in the weeds with people's families and trying to, have them have safe housing and safe living circumstances for themselves, for their children. And it was a really beautiful area of law. It was very difficult, but the good days were the best days, absolutely the best days. But eventually I found another passion and I wanted to pursue entrepreneurship and I wanted to pursue, spending more time on my own real estate investments. And for that reason, I couldn't do both. It kind of got to the point where I couldn't both have this 9-to-5 job at the government and then also be doing all this other work for our real estate business on the side. And so I'm like, well, then let me just put all the eggs in the real estate basket. And that was just over 3 years ago. 3 years and a few months ago that I hung my shingle and started doing the real estate work that I'm doing now. or at least full-time doing that, I should say. And during that time, we actually purchased a building that we thought we were buying an office building, but it turned out it was behind the scenes, low key, a wedding venue for the town. It wasn't, a Victorian building, and it had this beautiful English garden in the back, and we loved it. Our tenants loved it, but unbeknownst to us, we'd have people reach out and say like, hey, can we have our wedding in this backyard? Or can we have a fashion show in this backyard? And we're like, oh, here we were just thinking we have this, nice office building that was kind of a landmark in the town, but we didn't kind of know the behind the scenes that this was actually kind of a side revenue source, but also kind of like a really fun little twist on what we thought was a very straightforward real estate deal.
When you think about real estate and when you think about wedding venues and kind of this experience that you had of marrying the two together, if you will, but
yeah.
Right? Dad jokes. But if you, as you're thinking about that, do you think that it is a strategy that is maybe often overlooked by traditional real estate investors because there's a layer of work and a layer of process there that doesn't feel as passive?
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I think also you have to kind of decide what you want your wedding venue or any sort of venue to look like. I think that there's two ways that people kind of end up in this industry. The one which I think is more of my experience, where I have this investor hat first, and then this other utilization of the real estate came second. And then I think most people probably in the venue industry go into it as a business first, where they're like, hey, I want to start a venue business. And the real estate kind of comes secondarily to that. Mm-hmm. And so for us, we still haven't, it's still very much like a word of mouth venue for that reason, because it does take, someone to be boots on the ground that day and, making sure that, the place is set up right and then cleaned up right at the end of it. That we don't do a lot of it, but we also don't provide a lot. This is somewhere where, we're not responsible for catering. We're not responsible for their insurance. We're not responsible for porta potties and, just to, town licensing, like all of that kind of stuff falls onto the event planner. Mm-hmm. And for that reason, it's a very low cost venue, which is why I think, for someone who's having, a 30-person wedding, why not? But for, the person who was looking to create that into a business, I don't think that would be. But if we could do something, 2 or 3 weekends a month, then hey, that's a few extra grand in our pocket. Why not? Without a lot of heavy lifting.
Understood. So you're really, again, you're positioning it from a different perspective than people would be. Instead of coming at it like, I want to do a wedding venue business that I want to make whatever, $600, $700, $1 million a year. You're thinking about it. I'm going to purchase this building right as a real estate investment. And then if we get to make some money on the back end, hosting these beautiful events, then that kind of factors in. Bonus. Got it.
Yeah.
Got it.
And so I think when you're looking at it from a real estate first perspective, you're always thinking about like, what's the cash flow? We've got, our expenses, mortgage, insurance, property taxes. And then what do I have to do to make more than that? And then some. Same with, any other business. We've got our profits got to be more than our expenses. And so when I look at a place, this is a place where, we were renting out the conference room for a few hours per week to different groups. And we were renting out mailboxes. And so we're like, why not rent out the backyard? It's just another utilization of the space. How can we get the maximum value out of this, but also kind of still balancing like the time? At the end of the day, renting out a mailbox is a little bit easier, even if it's, $100 a month times, a dozen or so, than it is to, make sure we ourselves are around, because we self-manage our properties, where we don't have a property manager who will say, hey, go sit at the property today, make sure that, they don't put the porta potties in, the street that it blocks. So
do you think this is kind of an underserved or underutilized corner of real estate investing? Because obviously, you could go buy a big commercial building and rent out the offices and just have a straight kind of lease, more typical lease arrangement. But this is very creative.
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I think that there's a need for it, especially in like more secondary markets. Like if you were to look, I'm outside of Philadelphia. If you were to look in, Philly, thereue a lot of like these little venue-y places that are like a little warehouse or a a studio or something like that, where you can rent it out for a few hours, whether it's for a wedding or a conference or a retreat or whatever the case may be. But in these like secondary markets, and I'm only 15 minutes outside of Philadelphia, but when you hop over the river to New Jersey, there's not a lot of places. You've got like very large Italian restaurants. You've got the, very corporate kind of co-working kind of space, but like there's not a whole lot in the middle that's not just like a blanket, catering hall type of place. And so how can you kind of get that more flex space that I think is becoming more and more in demand, with being creative with the space that's already there? And I definitely think that there's opportunities for that.
Were you surprised at all as you're starting to get into kind of the wedding venue business, which is a different thing than real estate, right?
Most definitely. Yes.
What are some things that initially surprised you, or some things that initially were like, oh, whoa, I didn't realize?
I think for one, the fact that someone would even want to get married at an office building, like that just like never. And so I think it never hurts to just kind of test the waters. I mean, of course, there's like zoning and things like that can go into these things, but generally speaking, like it doesn't hurt to just feel people out. I was shocked, and the property's along like a historic main street with lots of boutiques and restaurants and things like that. And as we got to know like the other business owners, that's how we ended up hosting like the town fashion show for all the boutiques in the town, where it was in our backyard. And so some of it was just like, people know the space is there. They need space. Just let them know it's available. And if they do, then you'll become top of mind. I had never thought that other people would want the space.
Do you feel like from a pricing perspective, since you don't have to buy it, because you're not buying a wedding venue, I guess. Yeah. And so you don't have to make the payment on a wedding venue. You kind of already have that payment, and that mortgage may be factored in different ways coming from other streams of revenue. Do you find yourself, you have more flexibility or more freedom with the amount you can charge? So you can kind of book whenever almost?
Yeah. And that's kind of what we've done. I mean, I think we charged like $2,500 for like a flat 4 hours or so in the backyard. But that's it. Like that's more of just like us having the courtesy of giving them that space and that time and reserving it for them. Mm-hmm. It's, not something that is going to put my kids through college, but, if I was to have 4 weekends a month, even, then that's half decent revenue for not a whole lot of work on our end. We basically say, here's our insurance, send us your insurance, send us, a deposit. Here's some ground rules of what you can and can't do on the property. And here's the number at the town that you got to call for, if they needed to have like a liquor license or something like that for a few hours. And so that's it. It's a very, very simple model. But it's one that people have grasped to, especially in the pandemic, where, all these micro weddings have been popping up. Having a pretty landscape space for, $2,500 plus, their catering cost is a pretty budget friendly option, and it resonated.
Yeah, no, I've definitely seen that as well. There are people certainly who are spending $30 or $50 or $100,000 on their wedding, right? But then I think those more and more, people are becoming financially savvy, and people are using all sorts of tools. I mean, now they put the tools on, the phones for budgeting, and couples are thinking about these things. Do they want to spend all this money on a wedding experience, or do they have family members who are willing to support them in that? Or would they like to use that money for real estate or a house or whatever? Right.
And I think that's, unintentional. I mean, we definitely did not go into this piece of real estate with any real, marketing strategy for it to be a wedding venue. That was definitely not the plan. But in the end, we kind of realized that we were the only option. Like if someone wanted to have a really kind of small little outdoor wedding with parking and a bathroom, things like that, then like, hey, it really kind of filled a little hole in the market. And so like, yeah, are there venues out there that, can have, 250 people and have, $100,000 budget? Yeah. And that's not going to be for us, but that doesn't mean we can't make really, half decent, easy money with our approach either.
I love it. I totally love it. I think it's very neat what you're doing. And I absolutely think that it fills a hole in the market, as you're obviously finding out. Let's pivot a little bit. Let's talk to those people who are maybe considering buying a venue or starting a venue. And I want to take the next, 20 or 30 minutes to really talk about kind of this life cycle. primarily the beginning and the end, the purchase, the upfront purchase, and kind of some of the legal things to be considering and just from a real estate perspective, but then also on the back end, and something that we even started getting into a little bit about the sale and some of that. But let's just kind of go in the very beginning. When someone is interested in starting a venue, let's say they're starting to scout for properties or things like that, are there some very initial things that you feel like are the most important stuff for them to be thinking about, things that should be top of mind right away?
Yes, I think probably top of mind should be, where's the money coming from? What does that look like? Are you funding like equity? Are you getting partners in this? In which case, maybe your LLC needs to be kind of really worked in deep with, some lawyers to structure, even if these people are giving you money, do they have a say? Are they picking out the carpets and the drapes and all of that? Or are they literally just going to give you money? Or is this going to be a loan? Or do you need to go to the bank and get SBA financing or some sort of business line of credit to be able to get the ball rolling? What does this look like? Because at the end of the day, you don't want to be finding that out when you find the venue. Sometimes you may have to tweak. Maybe you say, hey, look, I've got options A, B, and C, depending on what we find. And then you move forward with one of them. But I think you need to have in your back pocket what options are available for you for financing upfront, because it can also, like I said, affect your legal entity structure that you're going to be purchasing under. Now, one of the big questions I often get, whether it's, buying a venue or buying some other piece of real estate that is also hosting a business inside of it, is, well, how do we structure that from a legal standpoint? Do I have an LLC for the business and an LLC for the real estate? And I usually say yes. I think that's a better way to structure things, is to have some company holding the asset and then some company doing the business. And you can see why, from like a liability standpoint, why it would be nice to kind of separate those two activities. You don't want a florist who feels like they didn't get paid putting a lien on your property. We just don't need that to happen. Yeah. And so if we can cordon those off, then that can probably minimize some liabilities. Now, look, it's America. You can sue anybody for anything. And so if someone slips and falls on the property, probably both of those entities are going to get sued and probably a litany of other people. But the point is that certain things we can definitely kind of cordon off. And there's no reason why, if, your insurance company for the property itself needs to be concerned with the business. Now, what does that mean in practicality? You're going to have a lease. You're going to have a lease between your business and yourself, the holding company.
Is that something that people should feel scared about? Because I feel like someone, and I guess I'll preface this by saying a lot of folks who are very talented in this space are really more focused on the art, right, of this business versus the business principles and kind of the structure and the nuts and bolts of it. So is that a complicated thing to put together, a lease between those two entities?
It's definitely not. And it's definitely something that I think any, local real estate attorney or business attorney can get, kind of whipped up for them very quickly, especially when it's between, I'll say, non-arm's length parties. These are not, two companies that are really negotiating with each other. It's you setting the terms with yourself. And so it doesn't take a lot of legwork, but you do want to have something that, perhaps clearly, delineates which one of these companies is required for, for maintenance or for holding what types of insurance, because if things do go wrong, the lease is also there to kind of say, hey, actually, this is the company you're supposed to be targeting because we've kind of decided that. And the lease would then go in to back that. Go ahead.
I want to ask a question really quick. Is this just an incredible opportunity for maybe someone who feels very passionate about the wedding and events industry, wants to start a venue, maybe even has identified a great market, or even let's say they don't have a market, but they just really want to do this? Do you think this is an opportunity for someone to go find someone else with that piece of property and sign that lease deal?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, some of this is just deciding what's the situation with the property that you want. Is it something that's available for purchase? Then great. Then you're going to be signing a lease with yourself. But if this is something where you're like, hey, I have an opportunity for, say, a 5 or 10-year lease on this farm or on this warehouse that can be converted or whatever the case may be, then what you would be doing is you'll be signing and negotiating a lease with the actual property owner, in which case, again, I definitely recommend having a real estate attorney review those types of documents because, again, the liabilities and the pointing of fingers and who's responsible for what is something that is sometimes locally can vary. But there's also certain customs in different industries. We're saying in, some industries, it'll be more common for the landlord to pay for things, but in the wedding industry, it may be more common for the tenant to pay for those things. And so it's important to find someone who's got a sense of how these things are typically negotiated. You don't want to be going to someone who, typically negotiates to buy like gas stations to probably negotiate this lease. But there's definitely industry professionals, lawyers in, I would imagine, every single state that can help you land and negotiate those types of leases.
Without going into it too deep, can you give me a sense, and the listeners and viewers, a sense of what is a good percent on return? Because obviously if you own commercial real estate versus, there's NOI, there's some different things on the commercial side. But if you are going to partner with someone in this scenario that we're talking about, right? Where you're going to go to someone, they have a piece of property, you're going to sign a lease, 5-10 year lease, whatever. What types of returns are they really looking to get? Is this like a 10-15% return, which is obviously on the lower side, or is this like a 40%?
Oh, no. It typically, it varies, first off, from region to region. Like the margins you'll get probably in like Southern California, where you are, probably smaller than where you'll get in more like lower cost of living, lower cost of area, lower cost of like expense areas where it's just lower cost. And so the margins that landlord may be able to get are just bigger. That being said, I don't think you should look at it because you're never going to know. You don't know what the landlord has in terms of like, what's their mortgage? What's their overhead? Like, you're just never really going to know that. And so what I think is more important to look at is what is market, right? In terms of like cash price per square foot. But then also, how does that play out? I don't know exactly because my wedding business is very different than I think most people who have like more of a, in-house type of venue where a lot of the services are provided. But like, do you know like how many seats you need to sell per month or per weekend to be able to make a cash flow? And then how do you calculate that out? And so say someone's like, hey, you can rent this for $5,000 a month. Well, how many weddings is that? Or how many, guests per wedding do you need to have to be able to hit those targets? And I think that that's more important for what you need to look like. I wouldn't worry about what the landlord's margins are because that will totally vary from market, but also from landlord to landlord. Someone may have no mortgage on their property and every single penny you pay them is 100% return. And you may have someone who has, a mortgage to, they could be almost underwater, and that may or may not affect. But what we really just need to look at is just what the market rent is. And there's definitely commercial real estate brokers out there. I think a lot of people think of real estate agents as, buying and selling houses, but there's definitely specialists out there that will help place tenants into like appropriate venues or appropriate, office spaces or retail spaces. Like I've got a client who is moving her boutique to a new place. And so she worked with an agent to help find the appropriate space for that. And so those are the types of people who would be able to kind of guide you and say, hey, this is a bit, high for the market, or this is a steal, or even sometimes with commercial leases, you're able to kind of negotiate for the landlord to do certain things like capital improvements to the property. So, hey, before you move in, I want you to refinish all the hardwood floors. And most landlords are willing to do that kind of stuff, some sort of build out, so long as you've got a long enough lease. And so as they don't want to be doing all of that for, a 1 or 2 year lease that you're just going to, make them do this again for the next tenant in a few years. But if you do, 5-10 year leases, a lot of landlords will do some amount of build out for you.
What is a team that everyone should consider having? Like if they're going to get into this, maybe they want to open multiple venues. Maybe they want to, maybe they're just going to open one venue, but they are going to do what we're talking about, right? They're going to kind of hack this. They're not going to go buy the property themselves and then lease it to themselves, but they are going to go partner with somebody. Who should they have? Is it a realtor? Is it give me some of the maybe titles that we should be looking for?
Sure. So in terms of finding the spot, I think realtors are the best. And that's what they get paid to do. They get paid to find the things that even aren't on the market. They network with people. They kind of know what's coming to market. Definitely having a realtor back pocket. CPA, those are like, no one wants to deal with them as a business owner, but unless you understand like your metrics of what you need to be hitting, where your, P&L looks like every month, what your cash flow looks like every month, you're not really being a business owner. You're just kind of like shooting in the dark and seeing where things land. I also think having a good business law attorney is really important. If you're leasing, there may be, some involvement that you have with a real estate attorney just to kind of land that space. But a business law attorney is going to be key to make sure, you're compliant as you're hiring vendors, and you're compliant as you're, getting your right insurances, and you're getting the right licenses with the state if you need to get certain types of licenses to have the venue. And so all of those types of decisions are really great for a business attorney. One other thing, though, I think with a real estate attorney that can sometimes help is if you need some sort of a variance. If the property is currently zoned to be an office space or something like mine, and you're like, hey, if this is going to be primarily now an event space, we need to go to the town and get. In some states, you may need to get permission to kind of change what the use of that building is. Same thing, something was agricultural. Now we're going to use it as a venue. And so just making sure in your due diligence process, as you're vetting a property, whether it's for purchase or to rent it, to make sure that you can actually do what you want to do with that space. Because sometimes you can't always do whatever you want with whatever space that you find. I mean, something that is, zoned industrial and you're like, it's the most beautiful warehouse in the world. The town doesn't want to let you make it turn into, a venue or something. You might not be able to do it. And so making sure that that's, clear up front before you enter either an agreement to purchase or a lease is really important.
Before we dive deeper into that, one more question about the kind of people that you should have maybe in your team if you're thinking about doing this. And thank you, by the way, so much. I mean, you were like a wealth of information. I'm going to watch this back, and I'm not taking notes right now, but I'm going to watch this back and really dive into this, because I think that this can serve so many people in different spaces and different stages of them growing their business. So I'm really excited about this. But talk to me through a couple of red flags. Like if I'm thinking about hiring this person, is there a general price? Obviously it'll fluctuate over the country, but am I hiring someone at like $1,000 an hour? Is it customary to have a retainer and they just kind of, we have a relationship that we've kind of set up that's on a per use basis? Like specifically for someone who is in the wedding and event space who wants to set up something like this, are there some immediate do's or don'ts that just jump out, maybe very high level things, right?
Sure. So, I mean, absolutely, I would ask for their experience in the wedding industry. It is a unique industry. This is not like a normal type of real estate, is also not a normal type of business. The same way that there's specialists. I mean, I know lawyers who only are lawyers for dentists. There only are lawyers for doctors who are selling their practices. And so there are definitely niche specialists. And you may not find like the most niche person, but like someone who has dealt with wedding problems, because the more you are dealing with clients, whether it's from a tax perspective or legal perspective, or even, the realtor perspective, like have you helped someone land these types of deals? It can be really important. And if you can get some sort of referral, or even just like the Google review. I know as an attorney, we can't always give out clients' names. It's privilege. And so I'm not going to be like, hey, you can call this client and ask if I was good, but I've got Google reviews. You can look me up that way. The other thing I would say to do is, in terms of prices, is that it definitely runs the gamut. If you're looking for more project-based work, like, hey, I need you to form this LLC, or I need you to draft me this contract, then I think you might be able to get like a flat rate from most attorneys. If you asked me 5 years ago, I'd say everyone does, hourly retainers, but that trend is definitely shifting away. Now, though, if you're looking for like more recurring advice, someone who, can periodically pick up the phone, ask them some questions, then yeah, I'd say you're probably still looking at some sort of retainer up front with an hourly billing type of situation. I think most lawyers bill in 10-minute increments or so, or 7-minute increments, depending on their style. And so it can vary, but I think probably most attorneys, again, it totally varies. Because I mean, I'm up here in the Northeast. Attorneys, I think, can bill at a higher hourly rate than they probably do in parts of like the middle of the country. But you're probably looking, I'd say, even in those areas of the country, for a specialist is probably at least $300 an hour for an attorney, but probably going up to maybe like $600, $650, especially if you're looking for someone who has perhaps like more advanced like tax strategy type of knowledge. And so that may not be as important in the wedding industry, but I know just generally in real estate, like the tax specialists do come into play quite often, and they usually have a higher bill, but they're usually more in and out.
Well, and it definitely sounds like if you're considering a 10-year lease or considering purchasing a property that could be, in your business for quite a long time, it really makes sense to invest that money up front to kind of get it done correctly.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you think about it, I'm just going to make up a number. Say you're paying $5,000 a month, which could be on the low end for a lot of venues in terms of rent. I mean, we're talking $60,000 a year over 10 years, that's $600,000. Is that worth maybe, $3,000 or $4,000 up front to, make sure that lease is done appropriately? I mean, we're talking, less than 1% of the deal. I think most people think that that's pretty decent ROI. And so just kind of keeping perspective on that stuff, because I think a lot of people see lawyers as just there to clean up problems after they happen. But lawyers are actually, and I think our best utilization, and frankly, our cheapest utilization is using us upfront to get things done right on the front end and then kind of going on your merry way. Because when things go wrong, like the cat's already in the bag, like the billing and the hourly stuff, that's really when it gets out of control. And so just doing a little bit more upfront, I can definitely say is good bang for your buck in terms of like long-term strategy, but also just long-term cost saving. I think you're definitely better putting that investment upfront.
I know we, across the venues that we manage, immediately hired a lawyer to help put together the contracts. Because my thought was I would rather have a lawyer review all the contracts and kind of set us up to be sued. Not set us up to be sued, but like set us up to handle like when that would happen.
Exactly. Yeah. Like you want those terms to be in there.
Exactly. So that it's a little bit more like we can calculate what it's going to look like rather than be completely blindsided and have all these holes in the contract and have all these different things that we didn't think about before. Like you said, it really makes sense to do it on the front side rather than on the back side.
Absolutely. And also when you're doing that kind of like upfront contract drafting, it really makes you think about your business itself. Like I'll give you an example. I've got a client right now. It's not in the wedding industry, but she's a contractor and is kind of going a little bit into the interior design space. And so she sent me this contract she borrowed from a friend, which is very common. I imagine happens in the wedding industry where you know someone and they give you their contracts and they're like, just go ahead and use it. And I looked at it and I said, this isn't matching up with what you're telling me you want to do. And so we can kind of do option A, which would look like this, or option B, but we can't do half and half. Like it's just not going to work out. And so sometimes when you're doing this contract drafting and you're talking with the attorney, it's an opportunity to kind of like troubleshoot and bounce through like, hey, what really is my expectation of, in her case, for subcontractors, but maybe for a wedding venue, it's all of the, the subs that you guys have. Like what's your expectations for what your florists need to be doing, or your bands or your caterers, or the in-house or outhouse? Like what are the expectations for them? What do they need to provide to you in terms of perhaps insurance and things like that? And so making those decisions, because sometimes that could be the decision of, do we want to have in-house or out-of-house catering? And, what is that going to look like? Well, in-house is going to require a lot more employees. It's going to require a lot more, kitchen and staffing and perhaps training and OSHA and like all of that kind of stuff, whereas out of house doesn't. But you also can make more per plate probably if you keep that stuff in-house. And so it's just there's no right or wrong answers with a lot of this stuff. But when you're creating the contracts and creating the policies and building out the business, the lawyer can be a great way to kind of say like, hey, well, if you're wanting to do X, then just make sure you're also thinking about what this looks like in practicality.
I feel like we're barely even scratching the surface of this. And I've got like 50 more questions that I can ask on this kind of formation front side, but I want to pivot so we could talk a little bit about kind of the end of the life cycle, if you will. Sure. Like, what happens when you want to sell your venue or sell your business or sell your, maybe it's even something that's been in the family for a long time and your parents or grandparents. And now you're looking at this going, man, I don't really want, I'm not invested. I don't love the wedding and events industry. I want to get out. Maybe you've got 50 weddings on the books. You've got a property. Maybe the property even has other things on it, a winery or, whatever else. What are some high level things that we should be thinking about? And then let's kind of start to unpack that a little bit.
Sure. I think the first thing you obviously want to be thinking about is like, what is the valuation? It can be very hard to try to value any sort of business. But I think the best thing you can do, even before trying to get a valuation done, is cleaning up shop. Because I've seen a lot of times things get loosey-goosey, especially when we're talking about like multi-generational stuff. Like if your books aren't clean, if you don't really know what exactly you have, a third party coming in is not going to be able to figure that out for you. And so if you want to get the highest and best valuation, then like, let's figure out what we have. Because you better believe that when a buyer comes in, they're going to be doing their own due diligence. And so just having that all up front is going to make the rest of the process go so much smoother. Another thing to think about when it comes to selling, and we talked about this a little bit before we started recording, is the fact of setting the expectation of what you want in terms of how the sale is going to go. I think a lot of people think that like, okay, I want to sell this for $500,000. And so I'm going to, put it up for sale. And on quote unquote closing day, I'm going to get a $500,000 check. And the reality is most business sales, whether it's in the real estate industry or the wedding industry or anything else, those deals are usually kind of with some sort of structured buyout where maybe they give you 100 or 200,000 at closing. And then the remainder of that is maybe you get 10 or 15% of profits for the next 5 years or something like that, or a guaranteed $5,000 a month for the next 5 years. And so it's almost like you're financing the sale in a sense as well. And so thinking about like, is that acceptable to me? Would it be great for me to get, kind of this built-in retirement of $5,000 a month? Does that sound risky? And then you can kind of play with those numbers and say, well, maybe I actually want 50% down, or maybe I'm only willing to accept a cash offer. Anything less than that is not worth my time. But figuring out like, what is it that you want? I mean, there's some people out there who would rather have nothing upfront and have, $15,000 a month coming in for the next 5 or 7 years. And they're like, well, great. Then that's, my retirement. It maybe is more beneficial from like a capital gains standpoint to be able to structure out that income rather than taking it boom all at once. Cause now all of a sudden you probably bumped up into the highest tax bracket and it's all just going to get taxed anyway. And so how do we, structure this in a way that it's most beneficial to you? And for that reason, I'd say the third tip I have is start talking with your CPA. You're probably already talking with them because you're cleaning up your books like we talked about and getting everything organized. But your CPA, I think, is going to be one of your MVPs in terms of the sale, because they'll be able to give you advice in terms of like how to structure this. So from a tax perspective, it's the most beneficial to you as well.
Wow. There's just so much there. This is so cool. When you think about the sale, the actual event, you talk about the closing table, you talk about, getting a $500,000 check or, whatever it is. What are we thinking about? What are we talking about? Meaning, if this property does have a lot of different things, and obviously we're talking with our CPA, we're getting our books cleaned up and things like that. Should we be isolating the sale of the asset, isolating the sale of the business, really treating those as two separate things? Or have you seen it come as a package deal, like revenue across this property includes the wedding sales and the lease revenue because you're leasing it to yourself?
So I don't know if you can necessarily count it as double dipping, but I've definitely seen it where it's more of a package deal. And then I think that happens very often where it's like, hey, I'm selling this building with the business. I think where the minutia comes in most often is, are your employees kind of going with them? Now, look, it's not like slave labor. You can't force them to, but if you're saying, hey, these key people, I've kind of pre-talked with them, they're going to do the transition. And maybe you stay on for a transition period. Like those are types of things you can negotiate. What about if you are just leasing and you don't own, are they inheriting the lease? Are they going to buy it out in some way? Are you going to, transfer the materials? What's going on with your vendors? Are they going to move over to them, or are they picking all new people? And so kind of talking about what the buyer intends to do with this and what the buyer wants to have out of it, but also what you're willing to give them. And so if you don't want to do those things, then maybe it's priced differently. Because there's a lot of people who they just want out. They don't want the transition. They don't want to be involved with this. Is fine. But maybe you're going to take a little bit of a lower price for that. And some people are fine with that. There, like I said, there are no rights and wrongs in terms of a lot of this decision making. It just comes down to like, what is your goal at the end of the day? And what is it going to look like to get there? Because I think the law and the terms, they can always be kind of sorted out. But at the end of the day, if you don't know like what you want the sale to look like and what you want your involvement in that to look like, then a lawyer can't really decide that for you, because all of those things really are on the table. And you may just get an offer from a buyer and just take it without really kind of knowing, hey, well, I kind of wanted it to look more this way or that way. Like,
do you feel like someone could buy a wedding venue business? Like, given what you know about the weddings and events industry right now. Do you feel like someone could buy a wedding venue with an intent to sell it? Meaning they would go buy a property,
like flipping it. Yeah,
exactly. But they would go spend 2 years, build up a book of business of, whatever, $600,000 or $800,000 a year, and then sell it at some industry multiplier to someone who's going to come along and want to walk into a scenario where it's already cash flowing and it's,
I don't see why not. I mean, people do that in other businesses, not infrequently. I wouldn't say all the time, because I think that is a niche area of like investing and business investing. But if it's done anywhere else, I don't see why it couldn't apply here, especially when you're in an appreciating market space. We're not in an area where we're saying, hey, let's go invest in, the typewriter industry. And like that's going downhill. And so if you were to purchase something now, I think the wedding industry is going to be smaller than it is now in 5 years or 10 years in America? Probably not, but I don't know that I'm like the greatest, wedding industry, economist out there, but it doesn't seem to be slowing down. I mean, I know what my wedding cost about 7 years ago and what weddings are going for today. And I'm just like, man, I probably would have had that micro wedding in my own backyard. And so do I think it's possible? Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you're one of those people who are out there and that again is your goal, then great. But sometimes I think you go into it and you don't even realize it's your goal and you're just like, hey, I'm over it. I want to sell it. And what does that look like?
Mm-hmm. This is just fascinating to me. I mean, with what we do with managing the properties that we currently manage and some of the other things, I'm fascinated with this topic. I have a question though that I want to conclude with, and then we'll of course leave links and everything for people to contact you more, because I really want people to reach out and even if where are you? Because I know there's some restrictions or rules as far as like where people can practice, right? Or have a real estate license. Can you talk to me kind of through some of that before we get to this last question?
Sure. So as an attorney, and I think some other professionals even in real estate have licensing requirements. I only took the bar in 2 states. So I'm licensed in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And so in terms of one-on-one work with real estate investors, I only work in those 2 states. However, I do have a program called Landlord Law School, which is applicable for investors anywhere in the US. It's not an international program, but it is available for investors in the US. And it has about 25 video trainings and 29 legal templates to help landlords be able to manage, grow, and scale their real estate investing business.
Very cool. Awesome. Yeah. So that is something that anyone pretty much across the US could take and learn a lot from.
Oh, yeah.
What about, so I guess what I'm getting at is someone who's listening to this right now, who's in Arizona or maybe Seattle or Montana or Texas or somewhere else, they really need to find a lawyer or a real estate agent or whatever who's in their state to kind of give them more specific information. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, definitely. And so if you're looking for someone to, negotiate that contract for you or your lease or to create those contracts for you in the first place, the best place I think to start is either with your local county or state bar association to get a referral. If you don't already have like a buddy who's like, hey, I love my attorney, go use them. I think referrals are the best way to find the best people. But if not, your state or county bar association are probably the best bet because they have registries of attorneys who practice in different areas of law.
Got it. That's a hot tip that I think is going to help a lot of people for sure. Okay, last question. So I have been exposed to a number of different real estate investors or developers who are involved on these massive projects where it's this big mixed use, commercial, residential development, right? There's actually one going in, right outside of where I currently live. It's like a mile down the street. It's the coolest thing. It's about 200 acres and it's, they have apartment buildings and they have these condos and then they have they're basically creating a lifestyle environment.
Yeah.
Some really cool restaurants and all sorts of different things. When you see something like that come in, a lot of it is, I think there's going to be like 1 million square feet of office space as well. But they're doing all of this extra work to make it a beautiful, beautiful environment. The office space side of it is, a Monday through Friday type thing.
Right.
The wedding and events industry is a Friday through Sunday sort of situation. Right. So do you feel like there's a lot of opportunity in the, I guess in some of these new developments to maybe even go to some of these these investors or some of these people that are putting in these big projects to say, hey, look, I could help manage your events program or and pitch them on that, because it's, from what you're telling me, it doesn't really sound like people are thinking about adding in events as much as they're thinking about other streams of revenue from leases and things like that.
Yeah. So I definitely think it's possible. I mean, the first thing my lawyer head, wants to say is, so long as the zoning, allows for that, then okay. I think that's great. And so long as, we're meeting, township requirements and that you can do what you want to do in that space, I think that's ground one. Another thing to think about, I mean, this is something we had thought about with our own office space, is kind of making their leases, while it's like 24/7, making certain access areas only 9 to 5. That way, if we wanted to rent it out again in the evening, like the conference rooms, for example, that we could reutilize that space in the afternoons once the typical working day is over. And the same thing goes for weekends. And so their lease is more like Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 in those spaces, as opposed to 24/7 access. And so long as those spaces have that, I mean, I'm thinking of an office building in Philadelphia where, in like the great atrium where you would kind of walk in and, the elevators are and everything, on the weekends, they put up, beautiful hanging drapes, and it's now an event venue. And this is a place that probably has, it's like a 35-story building. It's not the biggest building in Philadelphia, but it's a large office building, but it's empty, like you said, on weekends. And so for that reason, they're able to turn it into a wedding venue.
Wow.
It has been done. And so can it be done? The answer is yes.
Yes. Well, that's just so neat for me to hear. And I think for other people listening to this podcast, or watching on YouTube, because it's like, wow, if I want to do this, I don't necessarily, like, the barrier to entry gets a little bit lower. I don't necessarily have to go out and spend $1 million or have all this cash or whatever. Like, I can go find partners. I can talk to people like you, Bonnie, right? Yeah. And I can learn and get connected with people who have resources, who maybe don't want to execute the weddings on a day-to-day standpoint, but they do want to
maximize they want to maximize the utilization of their real estate. And so if you can say, hey, look, I'm going to give you an extra 10 grand a month. I mean, for a small landlord, that may be a lot. For a big landlord, they may be like, how much space are we talking about? What is this, going to take from us, in a sense? But maybe it's, $40,000, but, to add that to their bottom line for no real extra work on their part, it's just maybe a little bit of coordination. Maybe, instead they have to have, a security guard there on the weekends when they weren't going to have a security guard on the weekends. And so what does that look like on their end to make that happen as well?
Very cool. Well, so many exciting things to think about, so many opportunities I think that are there, but also so much value that you provided. And I really appreciate you coming on this channel. If someone wants to reach out to you, work with you, get your advice, take your course for, property managers, landlords, where can they find you? Where should they connect with you?
Sure. I say there's 3 main places that you can hang out with me. The first is on my website. That's contact form is there. And so if you wanted to reach out to me, that's the best way to do that, at bonniegalam.com. Easy enough. It's my name. I also like to hang out on Instagram a lot. Again, my name, Bonnie Galam, ESQ for a lawyer. And that I love sharing behind the scenes of my own real estate investing and horror stories of clients and just things I experience day to day as a lawyer. And then I also have my own podcast called House of Horrors, where I share legal horror stories of things going on in the real estate world. And so if you're into that stuff, it is very practical behind the scenes, breaking down what went wrong and of course what you can do instead. And so those are the 3 main places where I hang out.
I love it. We'll definitely go check out Bonnie's podcast. I saw that. I'm glad you let everyone know about that. But so much incredible information, and you're such an amazing resource, I think, for people who are really interested in getting their business set up correctly and just kind of thinking about this other element of business. So thanks, Bonnie, for coming on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a lot of fun.